With the secession of Zarathurma and the declaration of their rebellion, an intriguing hiccup of history occurred. The scholars who maintained the National Chronicle of Avarignia, a truly ancient tome known as the Occidentalian, staged a great heist and stole the original copy, ferrying it away to Zarathurma and offering their services as historians. This daring raid was motivated by the censorious crown, which increasingly violated their ancient rights and privileges to record history as they saw fit. And so now they resided in this land of gold and freedom, and established their school of history in Fort Zik, translating simply to book. Now, these learned men, who established themselves in Fort Zik, had the honor of recording the pirate wars which would define the region for decades to come. The first great battle of the pirate wars was the Battle of Mona Passage. In July of 1601, Captain Amalric had returned to the Windward Isles with 100 ships of his own to bear. In the interim, the shipwrights of Zarathurma had managed to improve their own designs from the wreckage of the First Crown Fleet, and boasted a technically inferior yet numerically superior fleet of 150 ships in total, though only 50 of them were of the highest quality, just barely enough to face these crown vessels without subterfuge. So, at the Battle of Mona Passage, Captain Kyrus Caridas thus tried to trick them again. They had engaged 40 ships of the Crown Navy out at sea, and with their own 20 ships staged a false retreat out between some minor islands. Here, greater numbers were lying in wait to dash them against the rocks, roughly 39 more ships. However, Captain Amalric suspected that something was amiss in one way or another, perhaps only by his gut instinct, and club-hauled his main vessel, dropping the anchor and rapidly turning the ship's broadsides at the hidden attackers. He then sent out the command for the others in his fleet to line up and do the same. The Black Fleet attempted to flee, but with their own longer-range guns, the Crown ships decimated their numbers, and the Battle of Mona Passage was a devastating defeat for the Pirate Republic, losing over 45 ships. It could have spelled a true end for the Hanged Man, were it not for an unlikely event back on the mainland. In 1603, ships from Toro began to raid Avarignia, launching a full-on war for slaves and the conquest of their lands in North Africa. They brought several tributaries to bear against Avarignia, like Igbobanue, Kanem, and even the now puppeted remains of Zamor. This battle was largely a naval one, and once again, whosoever controlled the Pillars of Hercules controlled the future. As such, the Crown had to recommit naval resources away from the New World and towards the vastly more important Mediterranean holdings. By 1605, they had successfully fended off Toro, but done so at extreme personal cost. Indeed, the majority of the Avarignian fleet was lost, and the coffers were nearly empty. During this time, Zarathurma had, through a litany of minute and treacherous victories, conquered a great deal of Nicosatte, and forced a treaty on the Crown, which ultimately signed the Treaty of Tortuga by Captain Amalric's hand. The Treaty of Tortuga saw Zarathurma take nearly all of Nicosatte's western holdings, leaving them with the paltry remnants of the Antiguan chain and Aruba. Things would continue like this for 3 years, during which time it was established that the Hanged Man would rule for life, but thereafter a system of elections would be enshrined and established, via their own version of that ancient senatorial body, the Athraeum. However, Zarathurma called its building something else, as it operated differently. As such, it was known as the Pre-Indo-European, or the Seat of Pirates, colloquially known as the Preta. The Preta, instead of being populated by hundreds of regional officials, individually elected by landholders, the Preta had only 3 dozen representatives, individually called Hus, meaning man. Each Hus represented a different guild, industry, or particularly influential band of privateers favorably looked upon by the leader of the country, the Mekhus, or Big Man. The Mekhus would be elected from the Preta by his fellow members and rule for a period of 5 years with unlimited terms. This form of government was highly responsive to the needs and interests of business and set extremely low rates of taxation. As such, funds came instead from piracy abroad, buoyed to a lesser degree by trade. As such, by 1608, Zarathurma had replenished its navy and elected to break the 10-year truce with Avarignia set out in the Treaty of Tortuga. On the 5th of June, 1608, the pirate wars continued. Abandoning their prior underhanded tactics, the Hanged Man and his Black Fleet led a full-on assault of the Antiguan chain and Aruba, which constituted all that was left of Nicosatte. This war consisted of sailing through the night and ramming decoy ships ashore and detonating them on land. This victory was so complete that Nicomedes fell in the space of a year, and by 1609, Zarathustra angled for an invasion of another Avarignian colony, Trunahynth, the power below. However, Captain Amalric de Pravia had since returned to the region and set up his base of operations in Trunahynth. This all came to a head in 1610 at the Battle of the Gulf of Darien. The Hanged Man sought to take control of an outlier territory of Trunahynth and thus secure control of the Gulf for Zarathustra. He boldly approached with 50 ships, split into two major groups, while 39 crown ships aligned in a neat broadside formation, ready to fire upon them. As the Black Fleet approached in wide, sweeping arcs in an attempt to break up their formation and encircle them, their confidence was shattered as the crown vessels fired from well beyond what should have been their range. The horizon cracked open with black smoke as typically inaccurate cannonballs found their mark in uncanny fashion. As they tore the Black Fleet to shreds, the Hanged Man had confidence in his numbers and pressed onward. Once they came within boarding distance, the crown ships heaved up mighty bronze dragon heads from below deck, attached to long tubes, and as they spewed fire, a fire which burned upon the waves, the fate of the battle was foregone. Captain Amalric, during his time away from the field of battle, courted Nam Ning's colony of Kaimor, which had also been terrorized by the pirates of the Hanged Man. Nam Ning, by way of Kaimor, had gifted them knowledge of the rifled cannon and so-called thick fire. This combination of factors marked the end of Zarathustra's once unstoppable advance. As Captain Amalric gave chase, he conquered Aruba and part of the Antigua chain for Trunahynth, demanding a 15-year treaty of piratical immunity from Zarathustra on top of it, at the Treaty of Darien. Thus ended the pirate wars and began a tense new age, one of unmarked naval combat, anonymous raids, and sometimes uneasy peace. Throughout the course of his life, Kairos Caritas would viciously raid the shores of Trunahynth and Kaimor, all the while taking slaves and ceding new settlements of the Pirate Republic all his own, a testament to the treaty's sheer unenforceability. In contrast, the now colonial governor of Trunahynth, Governor Amalric, would hunt him tirelessly, taking hundreds of prisoners and thousands of lives. Such raids featured daring naval tactics, with the Hanged Man making use of dangerous and unusual methods, such as ramming or boarding, while General Amalric made use of the best ships he could get his hands on, many of them direct imports from Nam Ning. Meanwhile, the first diplomatic actions of Zarathustra were to court good relations with Lai Zhou in order to counter the great enemy that was Kaimor. In 1613, Nam Ning launched a full-scale invasion of Rajasthan, seeking to exile them from Southeast Asia. However, this effort would ultimately fail, and Rajasthan would maintain its position. In 1615, Zarathustra underwent a huge building project, constructing shipyards and naval batteries across the country, a result of the Preta's first major vote. In 1616, many natives were enslaved in order to work the lucrative sugar crop which came to be Zarathustra's most important major crop. Zarathustra refused to participate in the trade of Africans as slaves, since that trade was dominated by their former colonial masters in Avarignia and their piratical rivals in Toro. It was also around this time that the colony of Pomo struck gold on the west coast of Peng Bay, spurring a renewed surge of settlement, bringing Pomo past the Rocky Mountains. This also sparked the founding of two new colonial administrations under Poyang, these being Palus and Shakora. This gold even helped to cross the waves, as Pomo's colony Iora swiftly came to dominate the coastline of that mysterious isle. On the 1st of July 1617, Avarignia declared war upon Zarathustra for the Antiguan island chain, bringing their loyal colony Trunahynth into the conflict with them. The Black Fleet, with lead time ahead of the Avarigine forces' arrival, intended to completely decimate Trunahynth before Rex Alejandro and Echidas de Roma could bring the full brunt of his nation's might upon their wayward subject. The first order of business was to launch a full assault on the fortified island of Barbados, which would in all likelihood be used as a major port of arrival, but also a launching-off point for a prolonged campaign from island to island. Indeed, this campaign went well. Barbados was under siege, Zarathumite ships blockaded the entire coastline of Trunahynth, and the Battle of Trinidad got off to an excellent start, being occupied by the end of the month. However, it seemed that Avarignian ships were much closer than initially suspected, as in August, 178 ships, constituting nearly the entire Avarignian navy at the time, came barging into the Caribbean with the intention of laying the pirates low. All 90 ships were called off the blockade to intercept the Avarignian armada, lest they disembark troops, but the Black Fleet was no match. The traditional open combat exploited the Hanged Man's greatest weakness, his fleet's inability to operate in a typical line of battle. 80 ships were blasted to smithereens, reduced to splinters scattered across the open sea. This was the Battle of the Mosquito Coast, and it was the young Republic's worst humiliation yet. The Avarignian armada would indeed come to disembark troops, occupying Jamaica after a short siege. This was when the war entered its final and bloodiest stage. As the Avarignian armada sailed around the Caribbean, occupying territory, Zarathermite soldiers tore across Trinidad, making landfall after the occupation of Trinidad, going on to swiftly occupy the Orinoco Delta. Despite this, one thing was certain. This war was no longer going in their favor. By November, the coffers ran dry, and Zaratherma was completely bankrupt. The ships they used for trade and to raid the coasts of their neighbors for goods had all either been trapped in their harbors or sunk to the depths. And so, on the 1st of March 1620, Avarignia annexed the Antiguan island chain. Thus began a period of stagnation for the young republic. Meanwhile, Gaijo finally returned to the colonial game, conquering various tribes in southern Peng Bay and establishing the colony of Lacandon from their base on the Galapagos Islands. However, it was clear that for the 17th century, Po Yang was the master of the age, with a vast colonial empire which brought in wealth from all the furthest corners of the world. Later that year, Nam Ning would once again invade Rajasthan, attempting to exile them from what they considered their rightful sphere of influence. This time, they found more success. Meanwhile, Lai Zhou began to sail around the southern coast of Pangnan and to colonize the continent's eastern coast. In 1621, a widespread slave revolt rocked Zaratherma, but it was put down within 3 months due to their poor organization. In 1622, Avarignia annexed nearly all of Zamor, leaving them with a single province. In 1623, in an attempt to regain some lost glory, the Hanged Man declared war upon the natives of Achisi, with the intent to take over their entire peninsula and give Zaratherma a foothold on the mainland of Peng Bay. The Achisi, who had no knowledge of boats or guns, were no match for Zaratherma, and they were overtaken in a matter of months. Having witnessed this action right on their doorstep, several Midwestern tribes in Peng Bay united into a single entity, the Pacha Federation. By 1624, Avarignia, to make up for the lost wealth that Zaratherma represented, redoubled its colonization efforts. It re-established Nikasate, as well as founding the colonies of Arvupes, or the Land of Trees, on Pengnan, Pumiapes, or the Land of Fish in the far north of Peng Bay, and even settling parts of South Africa. Indeed, it could be said that Avarignia was entering into a golden age. Later that same year, Zaratherma invaded the Kakchikel tribe, conquering most of their lands. However, Gaijo's colony of Lacandon now blocked the Hanged Man's path. For now, instead of engaging one of the world's great powers, Zaratherma settled on surrounding them with colonies. That same year, Po Yang's palace colony colonized Alaska. In 1626, patience ran out, and Zaratherma invaded Lacandon, gunning for its southern exclaves. This was fortuitous timing, since Lacandon was already locked in combat with their much more powerful colonial neighbor, Shikora. As such, the war was swiftly won, and Zaratherma strengthened its hold on the mainland. That same year, Nam Ning launched yet another war against Rajasthan, which they would just barely lose. In 1627, Lacandon wasted no time in recolonizing the region they had just been exiled from, planting their flag in the thickest and most uninhabitable of jungles, simply to have a claim there. In 1628, Lai Zhou launched a holy war against Japan and took Satsuma for its own possession. Indeed, the Japanese had kept the burgeoning forces of empire from its doorstep for unbroken centuries, but now they finally had a foothold there. The land of the rising sun could deny them no longer, or so it seemed. Later that year, the Gaijo colonists who settled in the jungle out of spite were wiped out by disease, allowing Zaratherma to take their place. In 1629, Christianity, specifically that of the Ujo variety, began to gain popularity throughout Zaratherma, but especially on the mainland. Meanwhile, Simulchianism was enshrined as the official state religion of Avarignia by Rex Alejandro the Holy and Achitas de Roma. In 1630, Quiris Quiritus, the Hanged Man himself, disappeared at sea near Bermuda. Upon hearing this news, Governor Amalric de Pravia pursued him to where his ship was last seen, and also disappeared. Many believe them to have fallen victim to a storm or a sea monster, yet still more say that the two of them were drawn beneath the waves by mysterious, ghostly forces, and now the two of them compete in a spectral hereafter to see who could lead more sailors to their doom, one leading navymen to their doom, and one leading pirates to their doom. A contest of souls between two men of great renown. And so, the first man to lead the Republic after its legendary founder was Mechus Alvaro Escor. His first order of business was declaring war on the Creek natives, taking much of their southern coastal land from them within the space of a year. This momentum continued in 1631 with the conquest of the Choctaw tribe and some of their allies' land. Later that year, Xiaojin founded the Picani colony to compete with the thriving Paulus colony in Peng Bay. In 1633, Lai Zhou staged their own invasion of Rajasthan in the hopes of gaining control of the Himalayas. Ultimately, they would succeed in this endeavor, becoming the largest great power in Asia overnight. In 1634, Zarathustra waged war on the final clutch of Yucatan tribes, and by 1636 held half of them as its own possession, while Guizhou invaded the other half for their own fledgling colony, Lacandon. Now, while this was a moment of victory for all involved, it did highlight an issue. They were running out of room. Indeed, not only was the New World rapidly being settled, but globally, empty plots of land were vanishing month by month. This manifested when, in 1639, Lacandon declared war upon Zarathustra, with the aim of taking the rest of Peng Bay down to Kaimor. This was a largely defensive war on Zarathustra's part, which ended within the year as Jokora invaded Lacandon again. In 1640, Lai Zhou invaded Japan yet again, forging northwards from their base at Satsuma. It would end in 1641, adding the Kyushu, Shikoku, and Shugoku regions to its growing empire in Asia. As their Huangdi, Gao Shu Zhao, famously remarked, "It seemed as though the chrysanthemum throne was losing its petals." Meanwhile, even the most unlikely players began to launch their own colonial endeavors, with Mongolistan establishing their own colony north of Arvupis. In 1642, Urad and Xiaojin launched a coordinated attack on Lai Zhou, forcing them to cede territory to Tianshuan, which had long since been decimated by its neighbors. Indeed, this constituted for them a second chance at life, however slim that chance may be. In 1643, Avarignia won a major war against Kilwa, conquering up Africa's eastern coast. All was not going well for Avarignia, however. In April of that year, Pumiapis contacted Zarathustra and asked for their support should they declare independence from Avarignia. The Pirate Republic, of course, accepted, sending weapons and advisors to the chilly north. Also during this time, with the looming march of Poyang's colonies across Peng Bay, Zarathustra began to court Xiaojin, in order to align with them against the great menace of the New World. Speaking of this menace, it seems much of the world had this same idea, as in 1644 the Yoran War for Independence broke out. This was sparked by the fact that Poyang increasingly began to use Eora as an open-air prison instead of a proper colony, and the people who built that place wished to see Eora given its proper due. As such, Eora and Pomo rose up in rebellion against the mother country Poyang and its monarch, Huangho Xiaoyuan Qi. Poyang's great colonial rivals, Guizhou and Namning, came to the aid of the revolutionaries, while Poyang's colonies in Shikora and Paulus remained loyal to the crown. In a twist of fate, Pomo offered an alliance to Zarathustra, seeking aid from a fellow breakaway. Having been snubbed by Xiaojin, Zarathustra pounced on the offer, avoiding the brewing issue that was a potential conflict with Pomo. Hearing this, Avarignia seized the opportunity and offered its support to Poyang, declaring war on Zarathustra. This set off a chain of reactions across the world. Triballia and Serdia joined Avarignia, supporting their most valuable ally. Then Rome launched an invasion against them to strike them down while they were distracted. Samogisha and Box had since been courted by Rome and joined the conflict on Rome's side. This led to Norland invading Samogisha, as well as Serdia and Prisia invading Box from both sides, and Phrygia thus invading the Balkans wholesale. This then led to Mongolistan invading Phrygia. Rajasthan then invaded Mongolistan in an attempt to regain some lost land, and Liao invaded Rajasthan. As such, the sides of the Aryan War of Independence were thus. On the side of the Loyalists, headed by Poyang, was Palus, Shakora, Avarignia, Tribalia, Norland, Serdia, Parisia, Mongolistan, and Liao. Then, on the side of the rebels, headed by Iora, was Pomo, Zaratherma, Rome, Samogisha, Bax, Phrygia, and Rajasthan. After all of this, the alliance between Pomo and Zaratherma wouldn't even last a full year, as Pomo was decimated at the Battle of Chumash in 1645, and the revolutionary leaders were put to death. Still, Iora and her foreign sponsors still fought for independence from the Lion of the 17th century, and the world was caught up in a globe-spanning conflict the likes of which had never been seen. Indeed, in 1650 they would have their independence, establishing the Grand Republic of Iora Fenkai, meaning Iora, separate. Regardless, none of this changed the fact that Zaratherma was, once again, alone. Now, the impact which the War of Ioran Independence had on the world was distinctly bizarre. While all the peripheral fronts saw only minor gains, it had come at great cost to all parties involved, with a death toll estimated to be a staggering 5 million worldwide, out of an estimated global population of 478 million. These conflicts even sometimes favored European powers. One such example was the Battle of Biscay in 1649, where the Avarignian Armada managed to turn back a fleet of advanced ships from Pomo. Another was the Battle of the Lowlands in that same year, where a haggard force of Poyang riflemen managed to land in the European lowlands in Rome, but were decimated by the locals and their knowledge of the terrain. The takeaways for both sides was thus: war was expensive, and even the best guns do not guarantee victory. This triggered a period of inward-facing isolation. For the West, they had to focus on rebuilding their population, refilling their coffers, and catching up with the Eastern peoples. For the East, they had to focus on cementing their hold over their own colonies instead of leaving them unattended to found more, redouble their efforts of technological advancement, and ensure that a savage nation could not defeat any of their number ever again. So, this traumatizing war not only led to a general unwillingness to pursue conflict, but also a sprawling web of agreements and alliances between villages, towns, cities, kingdoms, and empires, which essentially arrested almost any hostile or even outward action, and would do so for an extremely long time. There was one major exception to this, however: Zaratherma, the Pirate Republic. Not only would Zaratherma not sign any such treaty, they would expand their piracy to a global scale, stealing technology from the East which brought them near to par with them. If something would break the Great Peace, it would be the Black Flag. The next 150 years saw the global population explode to 870 million, with a horrifying amount of near misses and potential powder kegs for war. However, whenever it seemed that things were on the brink, something would happen, like a plague or a famine or an economic downturn, and ultimately things would return to their status quo. And so the Great Peace would endure, and endure it would, until 1800, when Shaoxin invented an engine which ran on steam, with pressure suitable to drive machinery, such as pistons or articulated arms. Little did they know, however, that such an engine would be able to drive history itself.